some of those front pages. We're going to start with The Observer. It's leading with an image of Boris Johnson striking a gong to mark the UK's departure from the EU, which he called a turning point in the life of the nation. Boris tells EU no more concessions. That's the headline of the Sunday Express. The Sunday Telegraph reports on the Prime Minister's fury with what he sees as the EU's attempt to renege on a free trade deal. The Sunday Times says British diplomats have been told to spurn their former EU allies, according to a leaked document. Carbon footprints, you see what they did there. The Sunday Mirror leading on the Prince of Wales flying 125 miles by helicopter to talk about lowering aircraft emissions. And the Star's Sunday edition has a story about the possible revival of reality TV show Celebrity Big Brother. And we're joined now by Rachel and Benedict. So we are out of the EU. Rachel, everything has changed, and yet not a great deal has changed yet, but it is going to. Of course, the talks begin very soon on our trading relationship with the EU, and the papers have got lots of different takes on this. Should we start with the Sunday Times?
Sure. They are all talking about what's likely to happen in terms of the negotiations, and a lot of them are focusing on trade. The Sunday Times has a leak, so obviously they haven't stopped. Past from Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, who says that UK diplomats should no longer sit with their former allies in the EU. They should not sit together. And there's also a quote that we should not be shy if Britain chooses to disapply EU foreign policy positions, according to Raab. Now, this is slightly worrying, I think, because, you know, does that mean then that this Boris Johnson government is more inclined to lean towards US on foreign policy positions? Because I can immediately think of things like the Iran trade deal, which the EU nations still want to honour, which is a good deal, and which the US has spent most of Trump's presidency trashing and undoing all that hard work. And then also you look at Trump's proposals for Israel and the Palestinian territories, which is a terrible proposal. It's basically the most hard right Israeli version of Palestinian surrender, complete annexation, giving up Jerusalem, accepting settlements, and putting up with a non-contiguous state. So does the UK want to align more with that than what presumably would be an EU position, which would be still following and backing a two-state solution with Jerusalem as a shared capital? So that is quite a worrying thing, if that is indeed what this government is proposing.
That's all according to Rachel Shappy, of course. Benedict Spence, you know, where do you stand on this?
My view of this is that it is all for effect, that it is all an image. We have to remember who it is that is in government at the moment, what party they represent, and what actually is the most important thing to that political party. The Conservatives exist to maintain their position in power in office. Now, over the course of the entire Brexit process, we've gone through the process of David Cameron calling the referendum, then stepping aside the moment that it didn't go the way he wanted. We've had Theresa May, struggling against all the elements to try to get a deal through that didn't actually appeal to the vast majority of Brexiteers. And you also have to remember what it is that the vote to leave the European Union was. It wasn't just a vote against Brussels per se, although a lot of it was to do that, but it was as much a lot of the rhetoric that we hear actually is not so much, oh, we've beaten Brussels, it's more we've beaten the establishment, we've taken on the system. Now, the great irony of this, of course, is that there is no one political party that represents the system better than the Conservative Party. And the language that the party has been using in terms of the last general election is not one of triumphalism so much as talking more about the seats that it won in the North and the Midlands as having borrowed those seats, of those, the members of the electorate having lent them the seats. They haven't claimed them permanently. You can tell from this that actually then what is very important for them is image. They need to be perceived as being tough on Brexit. They need to be doing everything not to betray what they think people have voted for, because we've seen what happens when that happens. You get something like the Brexit Party emerging out of nowhere and pushing them further into a corner. So a lot of this hardness, and we've seen it also elsewhere, talking about Mr. Johnson being very angry at the EU for perhaps, pulling, his feet, the rug from under his feet on a trade deal, although it's not actually clear what it is that they've reneged on. All of this is the idea that he's standing tough. He's not going straight back to Europe, when the reality of the situation is, and I think Rachel's touched upon this, as much as there is a real appetite for trade and closer relations with the United States, the simple fact of the matter is Europe is going to remain our single biggest market. It's going to remain our most important ally. So ultimately, that is the direction in which I believe we will drift. In the immediate aftermath of Brexit, though, there needs to be, or at least that's what the view from Number 10 is, there needs to be an idea that we are taking a firm step away, or at least be seen to be taking.
Okay, well, let's move on to the front of the Observer then, because that theme... Sorry, did you want to come back?
No, I just thought you were going to say that's according to Benedict.
That's according to...
You're
absolutely right. That is according to Benedict Spence. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Thank you for that. Let's move on to the Observer then. Their headline, Brexit Day 1, Johnson goes for broke with hardline trade deal. And... what Benedict is saying there is that there is going to be tough talking. Of course, there's going to be tough talking, not only from our Prime Minister, Michel Barnier. He's due to set out his table on Monday as well. And it's like any talks, isn't it? As we've seen, negotiations. Both sides start at extremes of what could happen or what they want.
Right, that's right. Boris Johnson is expected to give more detail on this, or start to give detail on this in a speech on Monday around what kind of trade deal this government wants and is seeking from the EU. But, we're back to the same observable points about negotiations, which is just objectively looking at who is the stronger force in that negotiation. Is it the EU, which is a trading bloc of now 27 countries working together, or is it the UK? And, just on the basic numbers and weighting, you could suppose that the EU has a stronger hand. I know Brexiters don't like that and disagree with it, but you could say that.
Benedict's moustache is bristling.
Is it bristling?
It's twitching.
It's been doing that for a while.
You've got it.
It's entirely a prop, just so that...
Like a barometer.
Do you know what? I don't entirely disagree with you. I mean, it would be foolish to say that the EU doesn't have the upper hand in terms of size. The difficulty with that is to then entirely paint the UK as such a small partner that it could be squashed if the two were to go toe-to-toe. The UK isn't Greece, and this is the thing. This is why I believe ultimately the two sides will come back together, because as much as the EU could punish the UK, really go out of its way, it would inflict a significant amount of damage to the EU for it not to be worth its while. Leo Varadkar used a football metaphor. He said, my side is stronger and I think we're going to win this. But this is the way you look at it. It's not going to end up being a 6-0 hammering. It's going to be a really nasty 0-0. It's going to be muddy. It's going to be bloody. There are going to be sending offs. There's going to be a lot of rude words said. And at the end of it, nobody will actually come away from it feeling satisfied if the two decide to clash. That's ultimately the way you need to look at it. And I do think that, the established systems are already in place, the relationships are already there. Of course, we're going to be talking about moving away and out into the world because that's the narrative that we've been sold. But ultimately, I think everybody recognizes most of our trade is still going to be done with the EU. Most of our, political, dialogue and our, military alliances are going to come with Europe. And I think that's just the reality of the situation.
Isn't that exactly the point? That you can talk about who's got the most to lose, and that Britain isn't Greece, but at the same time, Britain does want to get this done by the end of this year. Therefore, what can be done in 11 months, and actually we're looking at 8 months because it takes 3 months to ratify. And in that construct, what can be agreed? Well, it's not going to be a Canada-style deal that the Johnson government has suggested they might want, because that took 7 years. And if you do want a deal in that space of time, then presumably you are going to have to make concessions. You're going to say, do you know what, there's zero tariffs, zero friction, because how on earth could you agree that stuff line by line in 7 months? It's not even a matter of strength. It's just
we spoke about this in the first half of the programme. It's going to be, much like the Brexit Day yesterday, of course, was, what actually changed very little. It's, we're leaving, but in terms of actual physical policy, nothing much has changed. But it is going to be, people talking about it could take decades. But I do think every year to 18 months, we will get these deadlines coming and we will agree one or two sort of headline things. But you're right, we're not going to achieve everything in one go. Ursula von der Leyen has has already come out and said it's not possible to do in 12 months. But of course, again, from the great spin factory, that then means when we do get something agreed in 12 months, she can turn around and say, well, wasn't that fantastic? And this shows that we can work together and get things done.
Okay, that's according to Benedict Spence. Right, let's...
I
just want to show you the front of the Sunday Telegraph very quickly. We haven't got time to talk about this particularly, but Johnson Fury's EU remains on deal is their headline with the gong as well. And we'll have a look now at the Observer and talk about coronavirus just in a couple of minutes to the break. Rachel, they are going with quite an interesting line here. Travel bans plunge China into deepening isolation.
Right, so as well as, obviously having to deal with this terrible virus and the outbreak and the huge operation of trying to contain it as much as possible, although we are hearing, the figures keep rising, 12,000 cases, 259 deaths so far in China.
Even more in the last hour, actually. It's gone up to nearly 300, yeah.
Right, well, that's quite a jump again.
Yeah.
There are efforts to isolate China, obviously, because people don't want it to spread into other countries. Australia and the US have a ban on Chinese travel into those countries. Some commercial airlines or stopping their flights, and some companies such as Google and Facebook are barring travel to China. So this is the effect of being in this situation, which is that China is ending up very isolated, in a very isolated position now.
Yeah, it is increasingly worrying, isn't it? But there are people trying to find a vaccine, as the Mail is reporting.
Yes, the Mail is reporting on the story of a scientist called Kate Broderick, who has been working for some time, by the sound of it, on some sort of virus. And I think the quote is, she says, we're working night and day on this. And I do think it is interesting, as much as we have been talking for a very long time about how we're sort of overdue a major pandemic and these things sort of pop up all the time, we do live in an age where actually the miracle of modern medicine means that actually we are not necessarily that far off. We don't know, of course, but it is entirely possible to find vaccines, not for everything, but for a lot of things that once upon a time would have wiped out swathes of populations worldwide. One thing I would just very quickly land on, because of course there's been the talk of the reported case of the student at the University of York. One thing that was pointed out to me yesterday, which was looking for epicenters in the UK that you might see the virus breaking out, and that is student towns, where certain Chinese universities have relationships with UK universities, and they have very large populations, one being Liverpool, one being Manchester, and it is those are the places to keep an eye on in terms of whether or not we might see more of the outbreak, because of course that's where you do get a lot of Chinese students who have just left the tail end of Chinese New Year coming back for the next semester, so that's something to watch out.
Okay, we must pause there for a break. Thank you both for the moment. Coming up, why living in a town with an unpronounceable name could make you wealthier. I'll tell you why in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Rachel Shabby and Benedict Spence both still with me. Rachel, tell me about this. It's the Daily Mail have gone big on it. They're not happy about the BBC's Brexit coverage. They're not even happy about a kids' show.
I mean, the Daily Mail or the Mail on Sunday is rarely happy over these issues, but in this case, there was a 3-minute clip on children's program, CBBC, Horrible Histories. Now, the clue is in the name, in the kind of content and areas that it covers. It did this song version of history, pointing out that the things that are British aren't in fact British. So things like tea and sugar are obviously a product of Britain's empire and Britain's transatlantic slave trade.
So far, so factually correct.
Everything in this is factually correct. As I understand it, the Daily Mail and others are not happy because this pours scorn on the country's achievements, quote. But as we know, this is called Horrible Histories, not a history of glorious Britain's wonderful achievements. It's not called that, the programme. And I have to say that if we did have any kind of grounding, a reasonable grounding in Britain's history, in Britain's legacy of colonialism and empire, and slavery, if we were taught these things properly and reasonably and factually at school, then probably this sort of thing would pass without a blip. But as it is, there's just this incredible sensitivity for daring to mention that Britain did slavery and empire.
And the fact that it went out on Brexit Day. That's an issue.
It went out on Brexit Day. It was presented by a comedian who's quite a prominent Remainer. The idea that it doesn't give any context, it doesn't give any nuance, and that's the thing. I mean, I agree with you. It's a children's program, and it's only 3 minutes long, so there's a limited amount of. You can't give the entire history of the British Empire in a 3-minute clip. I'm not one of these people who turns around and says that the British Empire was all fantastic, because my view of history is largely that it's a good and bad on both sides, as it should be. But again, I think Rachel is right. Actually, we wouldn't have debates like this quite as often as we do, and increasingly we do seem to be having a lot of arguments about Britain's history, role in history, but also our interpretation of it, because actually I don't think it's really very well taught or approached. And I think, as we spoke about in the last half of the program, there are lots of other areas, the Second World War being one that we really fantastic, because my view of history is largely that it's a good and bad on both sides, as it should be. But again, I think Rachel is right. Actually, we wouldn't have debates like this quite as often as we do, and increasingly we do seem to be having a lot of arguments about Britain's history, role in history, but also our interpretation of it, because actually I don't think it's really very well taught or approached. And I think, as we spoke about in the last half of the program, there are lots of other areas, the Second World War being one that we really don't actually, for something we're quite so obsessed with, and we are, it is something actually that we really do not teach that well or delve too well into. And other areas of history are completely glossed over. Irish or Scottish or Welsh history are not really taught beyond the curriculum of those
Lots of history
countries.
teachers at home taking a deep intake of breath, but it's an interesting.
Okay, this is just the perspective of me and my moustache.
Okay.
It's
Well,
not
that's
fact necessarily.
Look, let's finish with this story, also in the Mail, actually. The headline, Unspeakably Lucky. Now, this story, Rachel, is saying that if you live somewhere that's got a very difficult name to pronounce, the house prices will go up.
Yes.
How can that be right?
Well, we have no idea, because the piece doesn't give a
So-
reason, and the piece does read like, a press release from an estate agent, frankly. So it doesn't actually provide any reasons, but it does seem that it has a list of locations where property prices are higher, and they have names that aren't pronounced as they are spelled.
Now, I just want to look at this list. At the bottom there, you can see Godmanchester, right? Now, according to the Mail, it says that you pronounce it Gumster.
Oh.
Now, I've got friends who live in Godmanchester, and they've never called it Gumster. I think this story's nonsense.
Well, yeah. Perhaps if there are people from any of these places.
What's your
I mean, I have a theory, which is that perhaps these are slightly more rurally remote areas in some cases, or perhaps historically they've been a little more closed off, but that there is a sense of identity or community that we all know of areas that are very pretty, very historical, and they tend to be what I think a lot of people call NIMBYs, not in my backyards. They're not really in favour of new builds, or not very welcoming necessarily, and therefore, if you don't have an
covering
expansion,
a lot of stereotypes from all these
absolutely.
places.
Well, I don't know. I don't know where I
could.
could possibly have got this from places like Bicester, but ultimately, that's the thing, is that you don't have a lot of new building, and it retains. Therefore, the properties, because there's a limited amount of properties, they retain their value.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
The longest town name in the UK, do you know? It's in Wales.
The Welsh one, I don't know.
Llanfair.
In favour of new builds, or not very welcoming necessarily, and therefore, if you
you
don't
are
have an
covering a lot of
expansion.
stereotypes from all these
Absolutely.
places.
Well, I don't know. I don't know where I
could.
could possibly have got this from places like Bicester, but ultimately, that's the thing, is that you don't have a lot of new building, and it retains. Therefore, the properties, because there's a limited amount of properties, they retain their value.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
The longest town